Hello, and welcome to Vitals and Virtues. I'm your host, Leo Barber. This is a podcast with a focus on the pursuit of a virtuous life from the perspective of a nurse. Join me as I review works of saints, philosophers, and sacred scripture, as well as interview healthcare workers from various specialties to help us learn and grow to be the best people and providers that we can be.
Clear?
Alrighty, it is time for episode 1. To give you guys a idea about the shape of this podcast and what it's going to look like, I am going to read and I'm going to talk about it for a little bit. Work through this whole book, hopefully, is Introduction to the Devout Life by St. Francis de Sales. I think it's a really good thing to get started with because it's kind of like a great foundation for anybody that's trying to develop virtues. He gives some good sound wisdom that I think, this book was written forever ago and it's sound wisdom for us today. So let's get to it. Introduction to the Devout Life by St. Francis de Sales. Chapter 1. What is true devotion? You aim at a devout life, dear child, because as a Christian you know that such devotion is most acceptable to God's divine majesty. But seeing that the small errors people are wont to commit in the beginning of any undertaking are apt to wax greater as they advance, and to become irreparable at last, it is most important that you should thoroughly understand wherein lies the grace of true devotion, and that because while there undoubtedly is such a true devotion, there are also many spurious and idle semblances thereof. And unless you know which is real, you may mistake and waste your energy in pursuing an empty, profitless shadow. Aurelius was wont to paint all his pictures with features and expressions of the women he loved. And even so, we all color devotion according to our own likings and dispositions. One man sets great value on fasting and believes himself to be leading a very devout life, so long as he fasts rigorously, although while his heart is full of bitterness, and while he will not moisten his lips with wine, perhaps not even with water, in his great abstinence, he does not scruple to steep them in his neighbor's blood through slander and detraction. Another man reckons himself as devout because he repeats many prayers daily, although at the same time he does not refrain from all manner of angry, irritating, conceited, or insulting speeches among his family and neighbors. This man freely opens his purse in almsgiving, but closes his heart to all gentle and forgiving feelings towards those who are opposed to him, while that one is ready enough to forgive his enemies, but will never pay his rightful debts save under pressure. Meanwhile, all these people are conventionally called religious, but nevertheless they are in no true sense really devout. When Saul's servants sought to take David, Michael induced them to suppose that the lifeless figure lying in his bed and covered with his garments was the man they sought. And in a like manner, many people dress up in exterior with visible acts expressive of earnest devotion, and the world supposes them to be really devout and spiritually minded, while all the time they are mere lay figures, mere phantasms of devotion. But in fact, all true and living devotion presupposes the love of God, and indeed it is neither more nor less than a very real love of God, though not always of the same kind, for that love, while shining on the soul, we call grace, which makes us acceptable to his divine majesty. When it strengthens us to do well, it is called charity, but when it attains its fullest perfection, in which it not only leads us to do well, but to act carefully, diligently, and promptly, then it is called devotion. The ostrich never flies, the hen rises with difficulty and achieves but a brief and rare flight, but the eagle, the dove, and the swallow are continually on the wing and soar high. Even so, sinners do not rise towards God, for all their movements are earthly and earthbound. Well-meaning people, who have not as yet attained a true devotion, attempt a manner of flight by means of their good actions, but rarely, slowly, and heavily. while really devout men rise up to God frequently and with a swift and soaring wing. In short, devotion is simply a spiritual activity and liveliness by means of which divine love works in us and causes us to work briskly and lovingly. And just as charity leads us to a general practice of all God's commandments, so devotion leads us to practice them readily and diligently. And therefore we cannot call him who neglects to observe all God's commandments either good or devout, because in order to be good, a man must be filled with love. And to be devout, he must further be very ready and apt to perform the deeds of love. And for as much as devotion consists in a high degree of real love, it not only makes us ready, active, and diligent in following all God's commands, but it also excites us to be ready and loving in performing as many good works as possible, even such as are not enjoined upon us, but are only matters of counsel or inspiration. Even as a man just recovering from illness walks only so far as he is obliged to go, with a slow and weary step, so the converted sinner journeys along as far as God commands him, but slowly and wearily, until he attains a true spirit of devotion. And then, like a sound man, he not only gets along, but he runs and leaps in the way of God's commands, and hastens gladly along the paths of heavenly counsels and inspirations. The difference between love and devotion is just that which exists between fire and flame. Love being a spiritual fire which becomes devotion, then it is fanned into a flame. And what devotion adds to the fire of love is that flame which makes it eager, energetic, and diligent, not merely in obeying God's commandments, but in fulfilling his divine counsels and inspirations. All right, there you have it. There's chapter 1 of Introduction to the Devout Life by St. Francis de Sales. So that is part 1 of the book. And that part is called Counsels and Practices Suitable for the Soul's Guidance from the First Aspiration after a Devout Life to the point when it attains a confirmed resolution to follow the same. So basically, this is just the first steps of trying to become a devout person, even before you really know fully why it's even good to be a devout person. I think it's important, he tells us about how you can't be devoted in a singular aspect and not the others. It's, unless you are being devoted truly and wholly to Christ, you're not going to be getting everything. If Christ is the way, the truth, and the life, then being devoted to Jesus is where you're going to end up with all of the fullness of everything. And if we're devoted to something that is less than that, we're going to get significantly less than that. It's like the principle of, kind of shooting for the moon, at least you'll end up in the stars, kind of, cliche tagline that you saw somewhere in your high school. Or like a man can be really great if he puts forth the effort to be great. But if he thinks, I'll just be good, he's likely going to be mediocre at best. And we don't want to be mediocre. We want to be great, right? And I think getting into some of the things in this book, we're going to be able to really see it get fleshed out in certain virtues and vices that, or certain vices that are tempered by certain virtues and the pursuit of those virtues. And then other virtues that will come by becoming more virtuous in one aspect. The other ones will grow. Anybody that's heard of Exodus 90, there's a lot of good that comes there where you start, building upon virtues through fasting and ascetic practices and that sort of thing. I think that's, kind of the beauty of the church. Looking back through history, we've always had, big feasts, but there's always a fast before the feast. And one of my favorite sayings is there is no triumph without a trial. Like you can't win if you're not competing. All right, so why even be devoted might be the question. St. Francis de Sales here tells us, in short, devotion is simply a spiritual activity and liveliness by means of which divine love works in us and causes us to work briskly and lovingly, And just as charity leads us to a general practice of all God's commandments, so devotion leads us to practice them readily and diligently. So what St. Paul tells us earlier in his letter to the Corinthians about how if we don't have love or charity, then we're basically useless. St. Francis de Sales is here echoing that, but also explaining why if we love something, we're going to do something because we love it. Think about the devoted or like loving spouse is going to, go to work for the love of the family, or, take the trash out, not because his wife asked him to, but because he loves his wife and wants that to be done already. So that, one, she doesn't have to ask, and two, because it's something like a nice thing, a nice gesture. And I use trash as an example because I have to take the trash out. But, there's all sorts of examples of why we should do something out of love, not because of obligation. Now, very often we are obligated to do something, but if we love that person, it doesn't feel like it's costing us anything to do that thing. A young man in love will do all sorts of crazy things because he loves a woman. And realistically, all of us married men should still be willing to do that for our wives here. But if we have love, it makes everything so much easier. Here is what St. Paul says in that letter to the Corinthians real quick. 1 Corinthians chapter 13, 1 through 3. If I speak with the tongues of men and of angels and have not charity, I am become a sounding brass or a tinkling cymbal. And if I should have prophecy and should know all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I should have all faith so that I could remove mountains and have not charity, I am nothing. And if I should distribute all my goods to feed the poor, and if I should deliver my body to be burned and have not charity, it profits me nothing. So at this point, you might wonder, okay, so love and devotion are basically synonymous. Like, these are the same things. I think they are pretty close. There's just a distinction between being devoted to something and it's like a higher degree of love towards something. So like if we love somebody, we're going to do the thing that we need to do. But if we're devoted to somebody, we're going to do that thing without grumbling or without complaining or anything. Like, it's just not going to feel the same when we're actually doing that thing that we need to do. And if we are called to love as Christ loved, this means we're going to be, devoted to a point. There was no grumbling that Christ had when he was getting crucified or carrying his cross. There's just like true devotion to the Heavenly Father and ultimately to all of us for what he did for us. We're trying to develop and become more Christ-like. We're going to see over the course of this book where St. Francis de Sales, the next chapter is the nature and excellence of devotion. Not to spoil anything, but he's going to unpack what he's getting at in this first chapter kind of throughout the rest of this book. And hopefully you guys have gotten something out of this episode, and you'll join me for the next one when we go over that chapter 2, the nature and excellence of devotion. Thanks for joining me, and this has been Vitals and Virtues with Leo Barber. This has been the pilot episode, so if you made it this far, congratulations. I have no prizes for you for listening this long, but, you made it. You did it. Thanks for supporting with your earballs, and I'm gonna stop now and be done editing. So whatever this is what it is. Generally, I'm gonna try to keep these episodes under 15 minutes long, but I am gonna have a couple more when I'm not just reviewing the introduction to the Devout Life, and I actually get to interview some people, which I've got some cool people coming on here soon. They'll be definitely a lot longer than 15 minutes when I do the interviews, but just for the book readings and whatnot, we're aiming for 15. So hopefully St. Francis de Sales can permeate your life this way on your way to your shift or whatever it is. God bless and take care, folks. Clear?